Hey there, and welcome back to the Beginner's Garden podcast. I'm so glad you're here today because we are revisiting one of my favorite and most practical conversations I have had on the show. If you've ever been curious about cover crops, but you weren't sure whether they would work in a small garden, in raised beds, or if you're a no-till gardener, this episode is going to clear up a lot for you. I brought in Parker from True Leaf Market to walk us through everything cover crop related. Why cover crops matter, how to plant them, when to terminate them, and how they actually improve soil health and harvest. We'll also get into things like which cover crops work best for raised beds or for in-ground gardens, what to expect if you're in a mild climate like mine in Zone 8 where not everything will winter kill, the differences between cereals, legumes, and brassicas as cover crops and why a mix may be best, and how cover crops can help boost not just your garden's productivity, but also the nutritional value of what you grow. Whether you're new to cover cropping or just want to do it a little bit better this year, you are going to walk away from this conversation with clarity, encouragement, and practical next steps for your garden. Now, note for those who are watching on YouTube or on Spotify, since this is a conversation that was recorded before I started doing video podcasts, you won't see Parker and I talking. But if you're like me and you listen to even video podcasts, like you're doing other things around the house or you're in the garden, you won't notice a difference. But I just wanted to let you know it's a bit different than what you may be used to if you watch video podcasts. With all that in mind, let's talk to Parker and dive into how to incorporate cover crops into your garden, especially going into the fall. Hi, Parker. I'm so excited to talk to you about cover crops because I think it's something that a lot of gardeners want to try to do as well, but they aren't sure, will this work for me if I have a small garden or if I have a raised bed? And then how do I do this? How do I not mess it up? How do I deal with it if I'm a no-till gardener? So we're going to talk about all of those things today. And I'm just really grateful that you're here to chat with me today.
It's my pleasure. And I'm thrilled to be here.
Why should a home gardener, especially someone with a small space, because many of us do have small spaces, why should we even consider cover cropping?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a whole lot of benefits to a cover crop. And the long story short is when it comes to cover crops, the real first thing that you've got to consider is it's really a question of healthy soil, right? That's really the whole point and purpose of cover crops in the first place is creating and maintaining healthy soil. And soil does deplete, soil gets compacted, soil has challenges, and cover crops are a very good natural to kind of rehabilitate soil. And there's different cover crops that do different things depending on what type of soil, and I'm sure we'll get into those details. But I mean, here's just kind of just a quick overview of kind of what kind of stuff constitutes healthy soil, right? So, ground rock and sand is part of healthy soil. Decaying organic matter is really probably the big component of healthy soil. Healthy soil's got to have bacteria and ideally other living things like earthworms. If soil doesn't have bacteria growing in it, it's not going to really produce. It's got to have nutrients. It's got to have the big three, obviously, NPK, nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. And then I'm a big proponent of, what I call micronutrients, right? You can grow big vegetables with NPK, just NPK. But what about all the other nutrients that are vital for human health, like selenium and vanadium and chromium and, all that sulfur and all that list, copper and zinc? That stuff, if you look at the way that commercial agriculture has worked for the past 100 years, right? Fritz Haber synthesized ammonia over 100 years ago. And so we've been able to have synthetic fertilizer, which, like it or not, it's fed billions of people, the concept of synthetic fertilizer. But you have the same farmland that has produced food for 100 years with only NPK being added back to that soil. And what about the other micronutrients? So I like the idea of having some micronutrients in the soil as a healthy component for me, especially in gardening, because if you're buying it from the grocery store, you're getting NPK grown stuff. If you grow it in your garden, it's a different issue. And then of course you need moisture and you need, a healthy texture and soil structure. If you have that, then you're going to be able to grow a great garden. But if you continue gardening out of the same plot or a raised bed, eventually that soil is going to deplete. And how long does it take to deplete? Well, not that long. So cover crops are a way to really rehabilitate and put back into the soil what's being taken out by regular farming and gardening.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of times second year gardeners can see this depletion happening because maybe their first year, especially if they're gardening in native ground, virgin ground that hasn't had any kind of vegetables growing in it, and their vegetables are amazing. And then the next year, they're just not so great. And then the year after that, it's still not so great. And I think that just kind of speaks to how that depletion's happening. And one way or the other, we've got to continue to add back into the soil because the crops are taken out of it. And I like your perspective of the micronutrients because what you're alluding to is that this is really tying back to our health because we need those micronutrients for our bodies. And what you're saying is that the cover crops, I'm assuming, is one way to be able to do that we don't get in what we might buy from conventionally grown produce. And that's not really something I'd considered before. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah. And one of the way the cover crops add micronutrients to the soil is, typically your garden crops are pulling nutrients out of the top foot and a half of soil. Well, micronutrients still exist below. And some cover crops like mustards and daikon radishes and ones with real long, deep tap roots, especially mustards, will pull nutrients up from deeper in the soil and make them bioavailable in the top level of soil where your vegetable garden is going to access it.
Oh, that sounds so promising with so much potential. So let's talk about how we can use cover crops. So could you just give us an overview on how to use them? We're going to go into the specific ones we can grow because I think that's where I got confused. I think that's where a lot of gardeners get confused. But just overall, how do we use cover crops from planting time, which for most of the cover crops is going to be coming up really quickly, all the way to the very end, and then having that soil to plant the next actual vegetable crop into? How does that whole process work?
So here's kind of the big overview, right? There's 2 times a year that you can plant a cover crop. I prefer planting a cover crop in the fall because depending on, what USDA zone you're in, usually that'll winter kill. And if you're a no-till gardener, that's going to be the ideal. You can also plant a cover crop in the spring, like early spring, like, February kind of a thing, late February, and let that cover crop grow for a month or 2 months before you terminate the crop. And typically you mow it, right? A weed eater or whatever. And at that point, you've got ground that's kind of rehabilitated. Now, here's kind of the real key, right? One of the primary benefits of cover crops every cover crop does this is it creates biomass, right? Some cover crops are going to create more and some cover crops less, but they all create kind of green manure, right? And depending on whether you want to till it under or whether you're a no-till gardener, and we don't take a strong stand one way or another. Cover crops will work absolutely for both. Well, the question is, if you're a no-till gardener and you grow a cover crop, it winter kills, it's lying on top of the ground. What benefit does that have to the soil? Well, the perspective that you miss, right? Imagine that you could take a camera and look at a cross section of ground where you've got the visible part of the plant growing above the ground, and then you've got the invisible part, the root structure that is growing below. Some cover crops have a root structure that creates more biomass in the root structure that is created by what is visible above ground. Like, typically the grasses will do that. Ryegrass and, wheat and barley and those types of grasses will have a crazy big biomass underground. Mustards also have a big biomass underground. So even if you mow it and remove the surface part for composting, or just let it lay on the ground and plant through that, and you've got some erosion control, you've got some ground cover, you've got some insulation there. There's a lot of benefits to it. You still have a big biomass benefit growing below ground. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that root structure and that biomass does quite a few things. The root structure typically, depending on the types of cover crops, and we'll get into that, it provides a structure for future planting, right? So you can imagine a root system that's there, that plant dies, that root system begins to rot and decay, which provides a pathway for new plants to tunnel down that same exact root structure to grab the nutrients. Some cover crops will produce nitrogen, which is obviously crucial. It's one of the big three. And that's kind of how it works. So planting a cover crop will do that. So I prefer, it's just a personal preference, I prefer a fall cover crop. So after you've cleaned out your garden, you plant the cover crop, give it plenty of water, let it grow. The only thing you want to make sure is it doesn't bolt and go to seed. That's the key. That's the key challenge. So as long as it doesn't bolt and go to seed, let it winter kill. And, I'm in Utah and it gets pretty doggone cold in the winter here and everything will winter kill. If you're in a more tolerant area, like, maybe Texas or Florida or something like that, you're going to have to terminate that crop by mowing it down, right? Or weed eating it or whatever. But that's basically the process. And just by planting the cover crop, letting it grow, and in most cases, it's not really more challenging than growing weeds, right? It's very easy to grow a cover crop. Just let it grow, make sure it gets plenty of water, and then winter terminate it. It'll self-terminate over winter, or you mow it down, and then you till it or you don't, depending on your perspective or your preference. And the benefit is there. So we'll talk about why some cover crops versus others and what the benefits of mustards are versus ryegrasses versus legumes and all that. And then what the choice is for home gardeners, right? Which is a nice blend in a mix, which we'll get to. But that's all you've got to do. Plant it, let it grow, terminate it, and everything else happens automatically, which is a very nice thing. It's very easy to do. And one of the best things about cover crops is, another little gardening term is, it's dirt cheap. Cover crops are so inexpensive to plant. You're talking like $5 to $10 to plant a typical backyard garden.
So let's go back to the terminating part, because I'm in zone 7B. Last year I planted winter rye, hairy vetch, and crimson clover. All of that overwintered for me. So there did come a point to where I needed to terminate that. And we'll probably go into that more later. But let's say we're talking to someone like me who's those crops that I planted didn't winter kill, or we're talking to someone who is choosing to do cover crops in the spring, because you did say that was an option, and they're going to need to terminate those too.
Yeah.
So what about those of us who, now you talked about mowing, weed eating. If we garden in raised beds and we're planting a cover crop in the raised beds, or if we're gardening in the ground and we don't want to till, you mentioned weed eating. Is that the main suggestion you would have on terminating? And then how do you incorporate that into the soil without turning the soil?
Well, the key is you wouldn't incorporate it into the soil unless you're planning on tilling it under, right?
Okay.
So if you're a no-till gardener, typically you're relying on, again, the biomass and the root structure to have created the soil benefit, which is the primary benefit anyway. Tilling it under is adding a little bit more biomass, but most of the benefit of cover crop comes from the root structure that you've grown there, right? So you can either let that lay on top of the ground, and again, it will provide some insulation in the cold months. It will provide some moisture control and help hold moisture a little bit. It might provide some erosion control by just letting that cover crop lay on top. Now, some people aren't keen on the look of that, right? You could also just remove it and compost it. So both are viable options.
So removing it and composting it, are you assuming that it'll be cut off at the soil surface and then you leave the roots intact?
Correct. You're just leaving the roots intact and you're planting your next garden crop right on top. And then those new garden plants will have a better soil structure, may have more nitrogen, again, depending on what you planted, may have easier channels to grow their roots through the path of the prior crop. So yeah, it's the root structure that is really the primary benefit.
Okay. That's new to me. I was thinking it was all about what was above ground. So, I mean, I knew there was a benefit, but I didn't realize how much of a benefit. So thank you for bringing that up. Heading into the fall, we talked about that you prefer planting in the fall. I think a lot of us, that's natural. Like you said, our summer crops are coming out. This is a time, let's consider cover cropping. When we're starting to think about cover crops, but then we look at our options. I know this was the case for me. There are so many different options for cover crops. You've mentioned several of them already. And then on your website, on True Leaf Market's website, you have these crops divided into cereal crops, brassicas, and legumes. So Let's talk about, if you're good with this, what benefits each one provides, because they do provide different benefits, and then maybe why a gardener might or might not want to consider a certain option. So let's start out with the cereal cover crops. What are those and what are the benefits, drawbacks, all of that?
You bet. So with the cereal cover crops, let me do this. Let's start at a more general level, and then we'll dig into the specific types of cover crops. And that is some of the other benefits of cover crops that we haven't mentioned yet, right?
Okay.
Like controlling pests, for example, and we'll get into specifically which ones do, but pest control, trapping moisture. Some cover crops provide competition for weeds over winter. Some cover crops can be used as forage. Some of them are very pretty. Hairy vetch will bloom, and it's very, very pretty cover crop. So there's beautification and some other factors. Now, different cover crops, as you've mentioned, do different things. So with the cereal crops, what are the primary two benefits of cereal crops? Number one is biomass. Cereal crops produce a huge amount of biomass below ground. The root structure, like if you've ever grown wheat in a tray, like for wheatgrass, you quickly realize that the root structure becomes just unbelievable. It turns into a whole tight knitted mat. There's a crazy amount of root structure for cereal crops. So even if you're removing the above ground growth part, you're still getting a massive benefit with the biomass. The other key benefit, and the reason a lot of farmers, and cereal crops really are more of a farm cover crop, especially like in the Midwest where there's high winds over winter, a lot of farms will grow cereal grass cover crops as erosion control, because that root system is so intense, it will literally grab onto every grain of sand and soil and hold on to it over winter. So it's really more than anything a biomass and an erosion control. There's other benefits, but that's primarily it, and a good soil structure.
Is that something you recommend for beginners?
I don't think so. For beginners and for home gardeners, here's the thing with cover crops, right? There's so many cover crops and it gets kind of scientific, and, professional farmers and professional agriculture will go, well, we've diagnosed our soil and we're going to go get this particular variety of mustard because it's going to do this for us. Or we're going to go and grab, this legume versus that legume to do some nitrogen fixation. And that's probably higher level than any home gardener's ever going to do, right? So for home gardeners, we have a kind of an all-purpose garden cover crop mix that's a little bit of everything, and it gives a good cross-section benefit of most everything that you're going to get. And I've never done anything but that in my home garden, and it worked great.
So what are some of the cereals, and would there be any instances that a home gardener, like you said, biomass is a big thing. So I guess give us an idea of when a home gardener might want to consider this for the benefits that it provides. And then what are some examples?
Fair enough. So probably the best example is if you have a really compacted soil, right? If you have really compacted soil and you don't want to till it, then I would probably plant straight mustard and daikon radish, because both of those are going to create a lot of breakup and create a lot of healthy soil structure as opposed to compacted soil. The daikon radish, some people call it driller radish, it's the same thing, is, you've seen the root of a daikon radish. It looks like a very, very long overgrown white carrot. And that really does a lot to break up the soil. So in a case like that, that would be one where you might have a specific need. If you were nitrogen depleted, and how do you know you're nitrogen depleted? Well, you're always nitrogen depleted. The cover crop mix has enough legumes in there that are going to fix nitrogen that it's fine. But if you were in a serious way nitrogen depleted, then I might mix in a little bit of worm castings, at least put that on the top layer, because that's going to have a lot of natural nitrogen in it, or plant some legumes that will do nitrogen fixation. So the concept of nitrogen fixation is that, and legumes are the best at it. So in legumes, you're talking about hairy vetch, you're talking about clover and peas and lentils and those types of things that are used as cover crop, alfalfa also. They pull nitrogen out of the air, right? The atmosphere we breathe is about 70% nitrogen. So they pull nitrogen out of the air down into the root system. And then they work with a rhizobia bacteria that's usually common in soils, but you can also inoculate your seeds when you plant them with powdered rhizobia bacteria so that you've got plenty of it. And that synergistic combination of the plant and the bacteria in the soil will create nodules of bioavailable nitrogen in the soil. So that's an option. But again, for most home gardeners, I think just an all-purpose cover crop mix. We have a garden cover crop mix that has pretty much everything in it. It's got daikon radish, it's got some mustard, it's got some legumes, it's got a little bit of vetch, it's got some ryegrass. It's got pretty much everything you'd want in there for the purpose of rehabilitating healthy soil.
Just taking a quick break here to thank our sponsor. It may still feel like summer, but fall planting season is here. And getting those cool season crops off to a strong start is key. Whether I am transplanting broccoli, cabbage, or lettuce, I always use Organic Rev to help give my fall garden the best chance of success. Before I plant, I mix Rev about 50-50 with water, just eyeballing it, and I dip the root ball right into the mixture. It helps reduce transplant shock and gets roots growing fast, which is especially important as the daylight starts to shorten. As we all know, those cool season crops do struggle sometimes when we're planting them in our soil this time of year in the heat, but we've got to plant them now, otherwise we may not get them to maturity. That's why Organic Rev is my go-to companion to help get these crops started out well. But even if you're direct seeding, like carrots or beets, you can water Rev into the soil to boost microbial activity and improve moisture retention, which is so important. Fall crops don't have time to waste, and Rev helps them hit the ground running. Visit organicrev.com and use promo code Jill10 to save. The fall garden was the very first time I tried Organic Rev 5 years ago, and I have never looked back. Your fall garden will thank you with less transplant shock, faster growth, and hopefully a better harvest. Again, visit organicrev.com and use my promo code Jill10 to save 10% off of your order. Now back to my conversation with Parker.
Now, for the legumes, I've heard different things. Do you, in order to get the maximum benefit of that nitrogen fixation, do you have to terminate it before it starts producing, or even, at flowering stage, or is it going to give you nitrogen regardless?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that for sure, but I'm assuming if it's starting to produce, right, and legume by its very nature, it's going to seed, right? So if it's producing, it's probably pulling the nitrogen back out of the soil for the purpose of its next generation, right? Which is its purpose. So you'd probably want to terminate it prior to that, right?
I was really sad about that, though, because like you said, the vetch and the crimson clover are so gorgeous and the pollinators love them.
Well, if it's flowering, I think you're probably okay. But when it's actually starting to produce, you're okay. But yeah, the hairy vetch is beautiful when it flowers.
Yeah.
Amazing purple flowers.
So the ideal might be let it flower for the pollinators and then terminate it.
Terminate it, yeah.
Kind of give it a good medium there. Okay.
A lot of it has to do with your growing season and when you plant cover crops. Like in Utah, pumpkins are kind of a big deal for my family, right? My wife loves growing pumpkins. We've got big pumpkin plants. They're already starting to just completely grow out of control. And we're typically not harvesting those until mid-October. So if I'm planting a cover crop in mid-October, there is no chance anything is going to get out of control at that stage, right? Unless we have a real mild winter, it'll generally winter kill. And you can also help terminate the crop by just denying it, some water.
Yeah, that was a big thing I noticed last year was I really had to keep it watered, especially in the later part of the summer, which is really hot here. And then once it got established, it really didn't require anything.
It grows fast.
It did. And I think I want to come back in a minute back to the climate thing, because that's one thing that I noticed when I did mine last year. But before we go there, you did mention a couple of brassicas. So those are considered good cover crops for different reasons too. The mustards, the daikon radish, I would assume, is considered a brassica. So can we talk a little bit about the brassicas and what role they play?
Absolutely. So the brassicas, the benefit of brassicas more than anything else. So let's summarize which ones we talked about so far. The grains are more biomass and cover crop. The legumes are going to be biomass and nitrogen fixation. And then the brassicas are going to create biomass for sure. But the primary benefit of that is going to be, in the case of mustards create a chemical in the plant called, I think, glucosinate, if I'm not mistaken off the top of my head. But glucosinate exists in the mustard plant, and it's what gives mustard its flavor, right? When that plant starts to break down and a cell wall ruptures, and through whether it's just regular biodegradation or whether it's an insect, gets its pincers on it or whatever, it releases glucosinate, which drives nematodes and insects bonkers. And it's a natural pest control. So typically mustards are going to have that effect where a daikon radish, for example, wouldn't. But mustards and like collards and radishes, while the brassicas there, those guys are typically going to be a soil structure kind of benefit. Mustards run a very deep taproot. Daikon radish runs a fairly deep taproot, but its real benefit is the taproot is so wide, right? So you can imagine when you have your lawn aerated, right? What's happening there is it's just punching little holes and pulling out a little plug of soil so that it decompacts the soil and gives the root structure that's still there chance to move around and breathe a little bit more and prevents it from being compacted. Well, that's what daikon radish does as a cover crop. It's drilling a big giant hole in the soil, pushing that soil to the side. And then when that root starts to rot, then it's coming back in and it's a lot less compacted soil. So typically that's the benefit of a mustard, a brassica like a daikon radish. But a mustard has a very, very deep taproot that can and does pull micronutrients off from lower levels than you normally expect.
Let's go on to the climate issue, because I was doing a lot of research on cover crops before I started. And like I said, I'm in zone 7B. My average first frost date isn't until November 1st. So we have a fairly long growing season. And I noticed that I feel like the way that my cover crops behaved was a little bit different than what I thought would happen. So let's just talk about that, because since some are winter killed depending on our climate, and some do most of their growing at the end of winter, which is what I definitely noticed with my winter rye and definitely with the hairy vetch and the crimson clover. They sprouted and then they grew and then they stopped growing and then they shot back up, at the end of the winter. So because the growth habit is so dependent on your climate, how do we determine when the best time is to plant these cover crops? We're going to do it in the fall, but when in the fall?
Yeah, if you're in a colder climate, you probably shouldn't have too much of a problem with winter kill, even of some of those perennials. Ryegrass is a fairly hardy perennial, so it may be a little bit tougher. So really denying it water in the spring, and that's sometimes tough to do if it's, if you're in a wet area, if it's raining or you've got a lot of snow melt, but just mowing it down real consistently, staying right on top of it. And you may need to mow it or weed eat it, right close to ground level a couple of times to kill that guy off. But if you can deny it water, that's probably the best bet. The other option is just do some cover crop that is purely annual and will 100% winter kill. The challenge is a lot of the legumes are perennial, like alfalfa, for example, right? So if it's a real problem, the final answer is till it under, and that will kill it. But if you're really opposed to a tilling as a strategy, you've got to probably stay on top of it a little bit more.
Is there a certain number of weeks that you expect to need that plant to grow before the freeze, for example?
Yeah, I mean, in our case in Utah, we can have a frost date that certainly happens in October after we're harvesting, right? But generally speaking, it's not that severe that it's going to kill off or damage a cover crop that early. So I typically will see cover crops where I'm at growing well into November, maybe even early December, but it varies from year to year. It just depends. So it's hard to know for sure because you can't predict the weather. Let me tell you one thing that was popular this year. So COVID created a pretty interesting phenomenon in gardening. 2020, for most of the other seed companies and suppliers and growers that we talked to, was the biggest year in the home garden industry ever. Like nobody's ever seen anything like it. And it was true for us. We had tons of people that were basic, kind of sequestered in their home, bored out of their minds, and took up garden. And this year it was a kind of a little bit of maybe a little bit of a COVID backlash. We had a generally kind of a colder spring nationwide than we normally do. So that affects it too, but it was a little bit slower year than we expected this year. And a lot of people basically just said, hey, I just gardened so much last year, and mentally I've associated in my mind with the COVID lockdown. So I'm going to take a break. So we've sold more cover crop through the summer than we normally do during the summer. So we have people literally growing a summer cover crop. Now, the only issue there is you don't want it to bolt and go to seed, because you're going to have volunteers that you don't want competing against your vegetables when you do plant your garden. So in that particular case, the strategy would be just make sure you give it a mow periodically, and don't mow it so tight that it's going to kill the plant, but just knock the tops off it and let that just sit right on top and provide additional biomass that might deteriorate and turn into the top layer of soil over a year, and let that continue to grow. So the real key is just prevent it from bolting.
Okay.
Right.
That's a good point. What about when it comes to planting? This is something I ran into this spring. Once you've terminated the crop, you've laid it on top. I weed eated mine. Is there a certain amount of time that we need to wait before planting the next crop for it to start breaking down, or can we plant in it right away?
I don't think you're going to have a problem planting pretty close to after that, but I might give it a week, 10 days at minimum. Let that biodegrading process begin with the older root structure.
Okay. That's kind of what I did. I think I gave it a couple of weeks and things seemed to work out fine. I didn't want to plant it too early and it hampered the new planting. And I did find that the terminated cover crop ended up being a really good mulch because I don't till. And so it ended up, working out really well. In fact, over the years when I've planted cover crops and I've terminated them and I've just kind of taken my hoe and I've worked them into the soil, that soil eventually ends up the most beautiful tilth of soil. Cool. And so I can see that working and making a big difference.
Yeah. And consider how some gardeners approach cleaning up the garden at the end of the season. They've harvested everything. If you look at tomato plants that are just nuclear, gigantic, well, typically, what are you doing? Oh, well, in a lot of cases, they get pulled up by the roots. And what you can also do is just cut it off at the top and let that root structure live in there and provide additional biomass, right? Rather than ripping it up completely.
Let's go back to just the home gardener and the beginner who's listening here, that we've discussed a lot of different things. We've discussed the different types of cover crops. You've mentioned the offerings that you provide on your website for mixes and how the mixes have several different ones that serve several different purposes. For a beginner, if you're talking to someone who maybe this year was their first garden, or maybe this year was the first time they're actually considering doing a cover crop over the fall and winter, where would you recommend that they start?
If it were me, I would start, I think, with just our basic cover crop mix. And after you have harvested everything out of your garden and cleared it, and again, leave the old root structure from your garden plants in place, and then take the surface part and compost it or mulch it or whatever you do with it. And then just reseed immediately, right? Just seed right on top of that. You seed fairly thickly with cover crops. And our cover crop, each product page on our website for cover crops talks about the seeding rate. But generally you just take a handful of seed and you're broadcasting, right? Just pretty generally. You're going to have some areas a little more dense than others. It's not really that big a deal because those roots will travel underground, right? So long story short is after you've harvested your garden and cleared it, just plant it and make sure that those new seeds get plenty of water so that they can get established. A lot of them are fairly hardy, but the more water that you give them while before you have a frost, the better off you're going to be. They'll grow faster. And that's basically it. And if, depending on what USDA zone you're in, they'll either winter kill or they won't, or they'll partially winter kill. Some of the varieties will winter kill, and you may still have hairy vetch and, a legume or ryegrass or whatever that you've got to mow down and maybe deny it a little bit of water in the early spring. Give it a couple of weeks, plant your garden normally. The basic idea here is you want to keep your ground full of living things all the time. That's really the goal, right?
On your mixes, I'm sure you have several different options, or maybe you just have one, but can you give me an example of which crops are going to be in one of those mixes?
Yeah. Okay. So our all-purpose garden cover crop mix includes Austrian field pea and winter wheat and triticale. Triticale is a hybrid, I think, of rye and wheat. I think, triticum and sea kale, right, is where that comes from. Collards, which is a brassica. Hairy vetch, which is a legume. Daikon radish, which is a brassica, which is kind of a soil structure. A couple of different clovers and some mustard. Not a huge amount of mustard, but a reasonable amount of mustard, because mustard does grow fast and it will go to seed as fast as anything. But that's a good all-purpose mix that is going to be a good fit probably for most home gardeners.
That's a lot of variety there.
Yeah.
And what I'm seeing as I'm hearing you say, I haven't heard of all of those. The triticale I'm not familiar with. Now, is winter wheat, is that different than winter rye, or is that the same?
No, it's a little bit different. So
Okay.
winter wheat is a hardier version of wheat, and which makes it good for a cover crop because it will continue to grow in the cold weather, right?
Okay.
Slowly, but it will grow. That's basically the mix. And, it's not that big a deal. You could say, well, hey, look, I want to do straight annuals. Grab some mustard, grab a little bit of daikon radish, grab some collards, and plant those. You're probably going to be just fine too. And then you've got 100% annuals. If you're in Florida, you might have trouble turning.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when you were listing that. I'm like, okay, some of those I know would winter kill where I am, but some I know will continue to grow. And I think that's a good mix too, because you've got some that are going to go ahead and start decomposing into the soil, and you've got some that will continue for the spring, which is always fun to see when they start taking off and then what kind of happens with them. So, I think a lot of it with the climate, depending on where we're at, is just a lot of observation, what happens with each. But I think one of those mixes would be really neat to be able to try and just see kind of what happens. Just to finish up here today, what would you expect us as gardeners to see as far as a difference? Like, we're planting a cover crop in our gardens this fall. What are some things that you would think that we would see different in our gardens moving forward?
If you've had a good, successful cover crop, you should see a healthier garden. You should see more vegetables. You should see bigger vegetables. You should see bigger, healthier plants, and plants that look healthier and sturdier, that aren't overly pale, whatever it is. Eventually, if you garden year after year without any kind of soil rehabilitation, without adding any kind of fertilizer, right? Whether it's a chemical fertilizer or whether it's a natural fertilizer, you're going to see degradation of the quality of your crop. Just going to happen. If you are planting a cover crop periodically and then maybe adding in, some other kind of fertilizer, whether it be chemical, whether it be natural, whatever your preference is, you're just never going to see that degradation. You're always going to look at and say, I had another great garden crop this year. That's primarily the difference. It's like changing your oil in your car. You're not going to notice anything. Your car's going to just perform the way it always has until you stop changing the oil. Then you're going to see the problem. And that's really what a cover crop does. And, it's not like it's an expensive deal. $10 of cover crop seed will take care of your whole entire backyard garden. Well, unless you're like really big, right? $10 worth of cover crop seed will really do a great job of rehabilitating and keeping your soil healthy and ready for the next year's crop.
Well, I think that brings us full circle, because healthy soil was what you started out with. And I just want to thank you too for enabling my listeners to be able to get started with cover crops this year and give it a try and be able to see what they can observe as a difference in their garden. And as you talk about just how cost effective it is, I think about compost. And yeah, I make my own compost, but I don't make enough compost. So I have to buy compost, which it's amazing. But when I compare the cost of that to growing my own cover crop, and then knowing too that over the winter, it's preventing erosion of such important topsoil, I think it's one of the best investments we can make into our soil.
Probably not going to get a bigger bang for your buck anywhere in terms of soil health than growing a cover crop. It's so cheap, it's almost free.
Parker, thank you so much for coming on today and chatting with me. This has been so informative, and I look forward to expanding what I'm doing with my cover crops this year. And I hope those of you guys who are listening will keep me updated on how you guys are doing. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
I hope this conversation gave you the clarity and confidence to give cover cropping a try, even if you're working with a small garden or raised beds. Like we talked about today, it doesn't have to be complicated or expensive, and the benefits to your soil can carry forward for seasons to come. And if you're looking for where to buy cover crop seed, True Leaf Market is a great option, but also consider Wood Prairie Family Farm, and you can get 5% off of your order at Wood Prairie's website with my code Jill5. Both options are great. I've used them both, so check them out. And before I let you go, if you are looking ahead to the fall garden, and hopefully you are, especially with your salad greens, I've got a free resource that can help. You can download my fall salad garden planting calendar at journeywithjill.net/fall salad garden. It will help you time your plantings just right for a steady harvest of fresh greens this fall and maybe into the winter. Again, that's journeywithjill.net/fall salad garden. And I hope this is the fall that you'll be able to have greens as long as possible. All right. Thank you so much for joining me this week. And I will chat with you again next week. And it'll be September. So we're going to be talking about things that you can do in your garden in September. I'll chat with you then.